Welcome to Concerning the Spiritual in Art, a podcast exploring spirituality, consciousness, and the creative process. I'm your host, Martin Benson. All right, y'all, welcome back to the podcast. Today I have Theresa Daddezio on the podcast, and we had just a really beautiful conversation around her painting and her practice and all these amazing ideas around like the inner landscape and how do we go about like expressing the internalized experiences of emotion and thought and feeling and sensation that we have into a visual form like a painting. How do we look at the outer world and look at sort of the patterns and rhythms and textures and colors and forms that we see within that? And how does that reflect sort of the inner experience as well? How do those things mirror each other? These are some questions that we were kind of like contemplating together. And I think her work is really about exploring that relationship between those things. She's an incredible practice. Her color palettes are so interesting. Her use of texture and composition and their relationship to things that are both familiar and unfamiliar really kind of bridges this gap between the inner and outer worlds that we occupy. And so I think you're going to really enjoy this conversation. We talk about yoga and meditation practice at the end a little bit and what that means and how that relates to maybe how she's thinking about her work. We talk about bigger ideas in art history, talking about sacred geometry and sort of the use of that within historical painting and what does that mean and maybe how that manifested and how that might relate to what we do today within our paintings. So just so many amazing little things that we touched on. It was such like a vast and deep conversation within such a relatively short amount of time. So I think you all are going to really enjoy this episode. So here you go, Theresa Daddezio. Hey, y'all, I'm going to cut in here real quick for all my YouTube viewers out there, just to remind you that the podcast also exists on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and any major podcast platform. So if you're enjoying what you're seeing here on YouTube, go ahead and subscribe on one of those platforms as well, so you can take the show with you on the go and never really miss an episode. Also, I wanted to let you know that I'm now offering subscriptions on my Instagram page at Martin L. Benson for 99 cents a month. That's less than $12 a year, which that funding will go toward helping produce the show. So I can continue to evolve the podcast, continue to create great content. So if you support what I'm doing here and are enjoying all this content here on YouTube, consider not only subscribing on the podcast platforms, but also subscribing on Instagram for that 99 cents a month so that I can continue on this path. So thank you all. Now back to the show. Peace. All right, Theresa, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. It's nice to be here and nice to have this conversation with you about painting.
Yes, I know. I'm so excited. I love your paintings so much ever since I came across your work, which happened through Instagram, but I immediately just drawn into them. I mean, there's just so much variance happening in the way that you treat your surfaces through color and texture, through this kind of like push and pull of space that's happening. I just felt like an immediate just attraction and kind of like almost like a tractor beam just pulling me into them. And so it's just such beautiful work. And I'm really fascinated by like the ideas or like kind of the way that you think about painting, just like looking at them myself and just reading some things online. Like it's obvious you're really interested in this cross section of like the psychological like landscape when it's in its relationship to like earthbound imagery that we see, like like references like from like botanical earth strata versus like the biological systems, but like how this sort of language, visual language, can be used to also communicate about something that's not tangible, which is like the inner life that we all have, this kind of inner existence, this inner landscape that we traverse on a daily basis. And so I'm curious, for us to begin this dialogue, is like, where did your interest in this notion of inner landscapes, of this kind of psychological interior space, come from? And how did you first begin approaching like using that experience of inquiry and looking at that as a way to express through painting?
That's such a really good question. And I think that there's a lot to untangle there in thinking about Where it started, I don't know if I can necessarily pinpoint an exact moment, but it's part of an ongoing exploration that I've had with the act of creating something visible, right? To kind
Mm-hmm.
of manifest an internal experience into something that you can um, see and perceive within the kind of visual sphere. Um, I think I've always been more interested in the act of creating something that doesn't necessarily exist in the world than I have been in a kind of exact mimetic experience in painting of representing kind of the what you would maybe say like purely perceptual, kind of one-to-one. And so for that reason, and then for other reasons of um, kind of these internal investigations, I became much more interested in these ways that the bodily experience can be transcribed or interpreted within painting through an abstract language. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's very important to my work as well, because of course, um, you can't, there's no exact referential point for um, an experience or a sensation, right? So
Yeah.
it does lend itself more towards the realm of abstraction where you or where I'm able to really distill a color or think about a shape and think about the relationship of that shape or color to its surrounding area. And I'm always thinking about the sensations that those
Mm-hmm.
visual effects bring. So I think my work does become very highly visual. I also want it to be highly sensory so that
Yeah.
it's more about the sensation or experience of viewing than it necessarily is about the what that I'm portraying. And so I think that lends itself more towards the internal experience, right? The way that
Mm-hmm.
these psychological things can be manifest in the body.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, I experience that all the time. Like, I think it's sometimes it can be very subtle the way that like a visual experience can initiate an internal sensation,
mhm,
whether it's an emotion or whether it's an actual physiological like buzzing or butterfly or like kind of like a gasp or like a
mm,
shift in the rhythm of our breath or the way that we like feel our body connecting in space. But like there is this incredible immediate experience that can happen through various visual stimulus that can really affect like the way that we are inside of ourselves. And so
mhm,
I think about that a lot as an artist too, about like how the visual field can become like a portal or a gateway toward for someone to like turn back within themselves and experience a deeper immediacy of like aliveness, of like a
mhm.
connectivity to it. I feel like in our culture we can be so numb to those things because we're overly saturated by imagery all the time. And that's why I think the kind of imagery you're making has this novel sort of feeling to it, but also this familiarity as well. And I think that that is kind of coming through your abstract language, through the choices you're making, through composition, but also through texture. Like when I look up like
Mhm.
at the close shots of your work, there's so much variance in texture on the surfaces as I can see digitally, of course. And
Yeah.
to me, that is such a fascinating like nuance to the paintings themselves. Like even looking at like the image behind your shoulder right now, like
Mhm.
seeing them at a distance is has a whole different sort of feeling. But as you get up close to them, there's so many little things that you're doing with the paint itself on the surface that I feel like creates a psychological space too. Because I think in my mind, like the act of making, like the consciousness of the person making it and the methods and ways in which they approach it, also like create a resonance within the piece that has an impact on us too in some subtle way. And
Mhm.
so I think there is this kind of amazing exchange that happens between artist and viewer, that can be incredibly subtle, but something incredibly important that we need to like dig into more. I'm
Mhm.
I'm curious, like in terms of like your own process for painting, like how do you approach like entering the studio? Like how do you approach beginning a work of art? Like where does the first mark come from or the first idea come from?
Hmm. Well, usually if I'm going to the studio, I kind of go in and I work right away, more or less. I do a little bit of tidying up, and I think that's it's kind of like also tidying up my mental space
Yeah.
simultaneously, right? Like a kind of cleaning or sweeping away what I don't need, so I can focus on um only the moment at hand. And that's really prominent in my practice, where I want the time of the making of the paintings to be read through the mark. Um, and I use a lot of repetition as well to emphasize that sense of the temporal or the time of the
Mm,
making of
yeah.
the piece. And it's also why, and one of the reasons why I am invested in the surface and the varying textures. So it doesn't become a homogenized image entirely. Although I do, at the end of the day, when the painting's finished, I do want that like initial gestalt to be very clear.
Mm-hmm.
But then I want it to be able to be broken down. But the work, I started a few years ago being a little bit more calculated about how I was making the paintings. I think it was just through a lot of trial and error. I was
Mm,
having a little more error than success in what I wanted.
yeah.
And I am very sensitive to the kind of light that appears in my work. And I work a lot with transparencies and something I call approximating additive color or
Mm,
additive light. So,
yeah.
like the light we're looking at now is additive, right? It's on a
Exactly.
screen.
Yep.
Um, so I think that also makes my work have this interesting relationship to like digital perception, but we'll get back more to that later. But it's yeah, so I needed the compositions to be more or less resolved before
Yeah.
I went to the larger paintings. So I started making well, I don't know, I guess I work really traditionally. So I'll make tons of drawings, and sometimes they're really fleshed out and other times it's just like a doodle, right? Like this
Yeah.
idea that I have in my head. And then from the drawing, I usually make several small paintings on paper.
Oh,
Um
cool.
and they'll take, they're kind of like they'll take a day
Hmm.
um, to make, maybe a little more, a little less. And I'll make a few of them just to really work out where I want certain balances to be within the painting. And then from there, I will then scale the work up. But um, it's really important that it's never a one-to-one. So
Mm,
even though I am working from drawings, from studies, sometimes smaller studies, I always leave room for the unexpected in
yeah.
the larger pieces, because for me, painting, it's not just about the like final image, it's about all of the things that happen with the transformation,
Yes.
from the idea to what's actually happening when the paint is being laid down, what that feels like. How is the light showing up in the painting, um where is the color really vibrant, and where is it kind of like subdued, all of these things that you can't quite calculate, that are
Yeah.
incalculable. And I it's so important to my work that that's part of it, and that also sustains my creativity as well. Because if there's the unexpected, it keeps me interested. It's almost like this puzzle I have to
Yes.
solve in the
Oh,
work,
yeah.
where I have some of the pieces as like a guideline, but then I don't have them all. So it they do become these kind of almost like chess boards, right? Of like this I have to make this move here, but then like, trying to foresee like, 3 or 4 moves in advance,
Yeah.
like what that
Hmm.
will do once I finish this other area in the painting.
Yes. Oh,
Um,
man.
Yeah.
That's such a funny way to put it, like chess, but I totally like as a painter myself, like I can totally relate. Like, and I think
Hmm.
this is such an important point, Theresa, that you're bringing up around like this notion of like a sense of direction or control or a sense of like understanding the compositional sort of beginning points, but then
Hmm.
giving yourself the spaciousness, the freedom for your intuition, for surprise, for magic to really enter the work. And I think
Hmm.
that is what's so amazing about painting is like we can, control the variables as much as we ultimately want. But if we try to control it all the way to the end on every single aspect, I think we choke the painting out of any
Hmm.
sort of like mystery that it might have been able to exude. And I
Right.
think that is such an important component for me is that because I feel the creative process is a form of alchemy. It's a form of magic making. It's a form of, sort of engaging with the mysterious components of reality in a very thoughtful and sort of intentional way. And so I think we have to kind of be in a dance with it. And I think you
Hmm.
can kind of see that in your work too, because there is so much so there's such surprise to them. Like I love looking at the installation shots of like some of your solo exhibitions to see them in space, like sharing space together.
Hmm.
And like each painting is such a surprise. Like even though there's similarities in certain aspects of them, there's a cohesion there, no doubt. There's a real strong hand, a sense of identity that of the one who's like kind of bringing forth these works. There's no doubt about it. But with each of them, there's so many like little surprises and things that are so like unexpected. And I think that to me keeps it so fresh and interesting as a viewer to look at,
Hmm.
especially seeing them all in sort of dialogue with each other in space. As you're building like a body of work, do you work on multiple pieces at a time? Like, or is it just kind of one after the other
Hmm.
after the other? I would imagine probably there's multiple things happening in your studio at once, but like as these paintings are coming to be, like, are you referencing like this one to that one and saying, I'm seeing too much similarity here. I need to make
Hmm.
something different here? Or is each one just kind of its own little unique, isolated journey?
Yeah, sometimes it's funny what you were just saying is like, oh, I see the similarity here. I need to make them more distinct. I feel like I often work in such an opposite way where I'm like, and I'm trying not to do this as much, but I'll make one painting and then the next one will feel so different. And then I'm like, where can I bridge the gap?
Cool. Okay, awesome. That's
Um, so yeah, and oh, yeah, I'm really trying to not do that anymore. I'm trying to work a little bit more iteratively because it's hard sometimes for me when oftentimes I'll have a lot of ideas all at once, kind of this like, manic creative frenzy. And I just want to work through it. And I feel like this real push and motivation to make the work. Um, but making studies has really helped me to slow down and be more
yeah.
decisive about um, what what it is that I want. And then also after having a few um, shows now where I can see all of my work in one place, I think it's helpful sometimes to think about um, how the work, like you said, responds to itself within a closed environment, and making a body of work thinking about how it's installed and how it responds to the space or that architecture that it's within. And it's funny, thinking about, right, like the work of responding to these more or less geometric architectures, while the work is responding to a physical architecture, like kind of
Hmm.
a bodily architecture,
Yeah.
right? So there's all of these ways that it's like in an enclosed space, and that's internal, and then the work itself is responding to um, our own bodies and their
Yeah.
enclosure. So yeah, there is a lot of this in the compositions, ideas of enclosure or kind of wrapping in or compression in the pieces.
Yeah. No, I definitely can see that because it is interesting. Like when we think about the functioning of our human bodies, like what's actually happening inside of us from just a straight biological, physiological reality, like the way that, blood is moving through the body, fluids are exchanging, the way that, your heart's beating, these rhythms that are happening, the way digestion's going on. There's like all these like enclosures, like everything is like a hollow space inside of like a vessel within a hollow space inside of a vessel, and
Yeah.
so they're still kind of like interacting with each other, and I almost see that kind of nesting quality, like the nesting of like the interior organs in the body. The body is a nest, and you have the organ's a nest, and so forth. Like I see that kind of nesting sort of happening compositionally for sure in a lot of your work as well, which I find to be interesting. But then you're also bringing in like, this kind of sense of the outer world too. Like you talk, like I know that there's, verbiage on your website around like botanicals, like looking at flora and fauna, and like thinking about like the natural world as well as another sort of vessel or container for imagery. And I'm curious, like how do you directly bring some of those in, or they're just kind of intuitive through your own just life that you've lived observing the natural world? Or do you
Yeah.
actually like specifically like come across some kind of new flower and I go, oh man, that petal is so cool. I like that form. I'm going to try to use it next time. Like, how does it work for you?
It's definitely both. Yeah. So, but I work abstractly, but a lot of the work and decisions in my pieces have come through being very aware of how to recreate perception, right? So through observation. And I still have a drawing practice where I sit down and it's a little drawing club. Like I sit down and I draw, right? And I just draw what I see. So there is a little bit of taking the observational system or language and trying to adapt it into a different system, or estrange it through an unusual color choice, so it doesn't feel as expected. So there can be a little bit more of discovery or wonder in the piece. And the incorporation of a lot of the flora in the pieces is something I started to do around 2020. The pandemic hit, and where I live has this pretty big rooftop. And so like many people, I started rooftop gardening as like a way to kind of save my sanity. And I got really invested in thinking about all of the interconnections between like the root systems and of course like the flowers, those are like the reproductive systems. But then all of the ways that it seemed like this kind of small slice of this microcosm of our kind of human impulse to temper with and change and adapt the quote natural worlds, right? Like as if we're outside of it, right?
Exactly.
We're not. But all of the ways, and those are these kind of technologies, right? Like even using vinegar or whatever it is, like to help a plant grow or to kill off certain certain parasites or to introduce different parasites, right? Like all of these ways that this ecosystem is really fragile, and then we consume these foods, right? And so it's like we're changing the world around us, but it's simultaneously changing us, right? And so there's this real reciprocity to that experience. And then I also, of course, think about that on like a larger scale, right? Like globally, the things that we're doing to temper with the natural world and the ways that that's responding to our tampering with. So that became a pretty big part of how I was conceiving of the pieces. And sometimes I like to think about the larger ideas I have in my work as being the kind of ambient background in the work. And if someone's interested, I am more than happy to divulge and get really nerdy about like all of this information. But if not, right, then I think that's okay. And I think
Yeah.
it's okay because I think that the work lends itself towards those conversations, just through the evocative forms,
Hmm.
in a way that's really and hopefully really intuitive to a
Yeah.
viewer. So, and I think that that's also why I choose abstraction, is it has that generosity to it
Hmm.
that, it permits multiple perspectives or different
Yes.
readings. And I like that openness, I like that spaciousness, and I like the ability for someone else to discover something in the work that maybe
Hmm.
I wasn't totally conscious of. So
Yeah.
um yeah, yeah.
I just think that's so important. You're 100% right. Like that's so important. Like there is so much thought that goes into it and process and like you know what I mean? Like as you develop as an artist, like you're working things out all the time and there's so much going on within you that's allowing you to kind of get in these explorational spaces where the work can kind of evolve and come out of. But at the end of the day, the work has to just be speaking for itself. Like you can't stand next to your work and have a litany of reasons why this is that and this
Hmm.
is this. Like you have to let them live their own life. It's almost like you've kind of created this thing and then you have to put it out in the world and let people decide for themselves what they want to take from it or what they're going to receive.
Hmm.
And I think that is such a beautiful component to abstract work, like what you're saying. It is generous, it is open, it does give people a space where they don't have to feel like they need to be right or wrong, but they
Hmm.
can just be and feel and kind of be in this space of direct knowing of what's in
Hmm.
front of them without having to like have an explanation behind it.
Yeah, I think for me the titles of my pieces are really important to give a little bit more of like a
Mhm.
clue or a guide to
Yeah.
what it is I'm thinking about. So the two pieces behind me, like as I'm saying this, I'm like, oh yeah, some of this is like very intentional. So
Yeah.
um this one, yeah, I use the right hand.
Yeah, you got
It's backwards.
it. I know everything's flipped.
Yeah, so that one is just called scarab, right? And so it's
It's
a
called what?
very scarab, so the
Scarab. Hmm.
the Egyptian beetle,
Yeah.
that symbolizes rebirth,
Hmm.
like the cycles of life and death. Um, and it's in the piece, right?
Yes.
The kind of
Hmm.
central form is a variation of the scarab shape.
Yeah. I'm like looking at it right now. It's like, yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Um, so sometimes, I think the titles do help, but if I was to say, yeah, this piece is a scarab, right? Like there's so much more happening in the
Yeah.
painting than just
Hmm.
that, but it's this element that can tie the piece together or to give someone a clue as to what I'm thinking about as the maker, as
Yeah.
the author of this piece, to have a shared experience, even if it's not exactly the same experience.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think titles, because I mean, everyone has a different approach to how they title their work, but
Hmm.
I'm in alignment with you. Like, I think titles can be an incredibly like helpful tool
Hmm.
to like point people in sort of the trajectory of maybe what was inspiring the work or what was maybe happening internally through the process of making it. I mean, that's something that I noticed. Oh, hey, Kitty. I love it. We've had a couple cats, make
Yeah.
cameos before. Oh, what's up? But like be able to have like some place to begin for the viewer where they can kind of get an idea of the what's happening within the artist. I feel like when I'm
Hmm.
working on a piece, like you go through so many changes internally around how you feel about it throughout the process of making it, and so many ideas are brought up or so many emotions are brought up through the act of making it. And I think the title at the end for me, I always look at it as a way to kind of like sum up my own
Hmm.
experience of making the work in some sense.
Right.
But like I think that that's an important gift as well to give people as a title, because it can at
Hmm.
least, whether it's a conversation starter or just give people some insight into the artist. I think that's can be so helpful. I
Hmm.
love the idea of the scarab, like symbolically, this idea of rebirth, this idea of recycling, of
Hmm.
dramatic change and transformation that happens. And so like kind of pointing back to what you were speaking to earlier, just a little bit ago, about like the microcosmic sort of forms in relation to the macrocosmic, and this sort of very amazing symmetry between the grand scales of cosmic reality and then the most minute scales. Like we see a repetition of forms, a sort of fractalized universal model. And for me, I find that to be such an amazingly like interesting clue about the mystery of the universe in some sense.
Oh yeah, it's so wild.
Yeah.
I was recently just reading about the essentially what is it, like a double helix shape that the sun will make throughout the course of a year. Right. And
It's
like the way that
unbelievable.
that form is replicated in like DNA structures, whew,
I
mind
know.
blowing,
It's
right?
crazy.
Yeah.
It's so mind blowing. It just, for me, like it points to this notion that like, because I don't know. I mean, we live in a, excuse my language, y'all, but a fucking shit show of a planet right now, you know? And
That's
I think
fair.
it's,
It's fair.
and I think it's, it seems if you look through history, it seems like that's always kind of the case. But
Hmm.
like within that, within the shit show, there are moments of absolute perfection and beauty happening all around you if you can choose to like see it, you know? And within that container, there is this immensity of interrelatedness, of interdependence, of a complete balance of opposing forces
Hmm.
across the entire universe. I mean, that's how it's like kind of all held together. I mean, we all know the yin yang symbol, right? As like this kind of embodiment of the dualistic principles of life. You know, it
Hmm.
really kind of has so much wisdom just in that one symbol. But what I feel like I try to do is like walk along the line, not on you. You know what I mean? That line that
Hmm.
cuts through the yin yang, like the razor's edge between opposites. And it's
Hmm.
really, really hard to do. But I think art and painting in some ways can also be sort of a metaphor for this kind of experience of the individual grappling with opposing forces.
Hmm.
And I can see that kind of tension in your work too, whether it's through the variation of texture or like your color palettes, like the subdued, more subtle tones
Hmm.
of color in relation to the hyper vibrant, saturated color that you use. But then also, like, there is this kind of creative, destructive, compositional component to them as well. When I look at like, when I think about like the actual structure of where the forms and the colors lay within a particular painting, there is this kind of nice tension there. Is this
Hmm.
something that you think about directly too? Like this kind of like tension or this sort of like playfulness between like opposing qualities
Hmm.
within your work? Because at the end of the day, there is that there, but then there's also this outer sphere of harmony, of like
Hmm.
of sense making that happens within them too, which I find to be a nice paradox within the work that that's what I'm kind of seeing in them sometimes. So
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's funny. It's like some of the compositional principles go back to like, even Renaissance principles of thinking about balance and contrapposto, right? Like,
mm-hmm.
in order for something to feel balanced, it actually needs to be slightly off balanced, right?
Yeah.
So I think things are better seen through contrast or through those opposing forces.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know if I'm consciously doing that. I've thought a little bit more than I had in the past about ideas maybe of sacred geometry, but within lineage of painting.
mm-hmm.
Um, there are so many scholars who have dissected, like, even the artist at times, but dissected paintings from, say, the Renaissance era or neoclassical painting, like thinking
Mm-hmm.
about like David's, death of Socrates, right?
Mm-hmm.
And finding these certain triangular shapes and compositions within
Mm-hmm.
the painting. And I think that's lovely and that's wonderful, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how much of that is just this beautiful coincidental thing that happens in composition where you can find and discover um, certain mathematic principles, right?
Yeah.
And it's kind of like fractal theory as well. But I'm not 100% intentional. And I think that comes from me needing to allow my intuition to be at play in the paintings. Because when else in our lives do we have that opportunity? I think it's such a special gift that we have as artists, as painters, to be able to use our creation, our invention, our intuition in order to make something. And yeah.
It is such a gift. It is such a, I mean, I think about it all the time, just how grateful that I am that I've kind of found this path. It's a life path. Like that's what I tell like my students or tell a lot of people who are like were really engaged with me about what an artist is or what art is. You know, it's really a path of life. It's like sort of a way, it's like a way in which you can perform actions in the world that can have a feedback system of helping you grow your wisdom or grow your consciousness, especially if there's deep, authentic intention and engagement with the process of the creative act itself. I think that's so important. But back to kind of what you were saying about like the sacred geometry and the sort of intuitive coincidental component that it can kind of seem like maybe there was like a lot of drafting and like absolute mathematical composition building for a lot of these artists, which some of them were like Da Vinci, 100%. Like he was all about, understanding, like he was a polymath. I mean, he was just really interested in the bridging of spirituality and science, and math. It seems for him and a lot of people in that sort of school of thinking was sort of like a tool or language that they can use to try to discover that bridge between those two. And so I definitely see that. And I find it fascinating. I mean, we see it all over the universe. I mean, you're speaking about like the double helix of like the sun, the way that the sun's moving constantly around the ecliptic, of the Milky Way. But also you can think about like the relationship between like Venus and the Earth and the sun and those orbits, and they create the Venus star, this like perfect pentagonal geometric form that's just gorgeous. Or with all the planets, really, they're creating these perfect symmetries, these perfect mandalas through their movement through space, which is like mind blowing. But we also like are seeing like the principles of like phi ratio, which is like the proportions of the human body. We see them there. We see them in the proportions of trees, of everything. So there is this kind of like underpinning language of the universe that has a real order to it, which is fascinating, that out of that order comes like the chaos, but out of that chaos it comes back into order. It kind of like goes up and down like a sine wave through those things. But I think that to your point about the intuition, it's like we are made of these principles, like literally our whatever consciousness is, which we can maybe dig into because it's kind of a mystery, like what is the nature of consciousness itself. But everything about who we are and what we are has been created by these unbelievably perfect principles of geometry and math that are outlined in there. So in some ways we're made of this stuff. So of course the things we make are going to kind of be reflective or mirroring these principles, even if it's not intentional, because of our way of sense making in the world. So I find that those sort of like ideas to be really interesting, the intentional use of these things, but also just the intuitive use of them based on the reality that this is what we are made of in a sense.
Right. I mean, it's funny, like the intuitive use is thinking about early counting systems, right? Like you'd count using your joints. Some cultures still count using joints in their fingers of a 28 system, or like a foot system, right? Like what is that from? Literally like a foot, or even like people that have menstrual cycles, right? Like this system of counting the months, right? That's aligned with the moon, like, and that's this very embodied experience. So it's like it's almost more than intuition, right? It's kind of like our physical being is part of these mathematic I guess systems or principles that exist, and it might be
Mhm.
a little bit of chicken or egg kind of thing going on a
Yeah.
little bit. But it leads me to think about this idea of, like what abstraction is, because
Mhm.
in some sense you could intuit that all of the forms or shapes that we can create are reconstructions of what we experience or
Mm.
see,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
So we're not entirely just making something up.
Exactly. Yeah.
um it's already there. So
Yeah.
um it's yeah, it's kind of wild in that way, when you really get deep and think about what is this that we're
Yeah.
doing and creating.
Yeah, because we're absorbing so much all the time through our conscious and unconscious
Hmm.
mind. Like we are taking in all the light, all the sounds, all the shadows, all the forms, all the colors, all the feelings in our body. Like, there's so many things that are being registered in the unconscious that is kind of almost ingrained into like these systems of thinking that come back out again in
Hmm.
ways that we're not aware of all the time or in control of, which I do think is really interesting. It's like we are seeing, and that's what I think you see a lot in painting. It's like these things come out of us through the painting process or through just creative process, through making of anything,
Hmm.
that were borrowed from somewhere. Like
Hmm.
it begs the question, like, is there anything ultimately really original, or is it a really just a rehashing and reshaping of what's already always been there?
Yeah.
And to me, I don't really have an exact answer. I do feel like each one of us have a perfectly individualized, subjective point of view on the universe that like no one else can ever fully embody. Like I can never, no matter what, look out of your eyes and experience the world through your whole mind body system. Like
Hmm.
through your past and your present and your hopes or feelings or projections of future. I can't, it's an impossibility. And the same things for all of us. I think that's our gift, is like our individual like vantage point or perspective on
Hmm.
this reality. And I think that's why art always has found its way into the human spirit from the
Hmm.
very beginning. It's like it's a way to sort of like express like our own sense of being here, our own
Hmm.
sense of like presence, our own sense of like we have a vantage point on this that's unique, and fascinating. And so I think that to me, as is almost what drives art itself, is the reality of the individual sort of point of view, that can't be replaced or replicated by another. And
Hmm.
so that to me gives me a sense of like of infinite originality because
Hmm.
of that fact. Where do you think that this kind of leads you within the development of your art, like as you continue to
Hmm.
evolve, like how do these ideas or these thoughts like kind of like play into like the evolution? Because I think as artists, like we want to evolve, we want to see this language that we're
Hmm.
cultivating grow and expand its capacity to communicate. For you, where do you feel like things are leading you?
I think at this point in my work, the previous piece informs the next, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
it does have this way that it's working almost serially or sequentially. Um, and the work is, I always feel it's kind of like this call and response type of relationship, where I make a certain decisions in one piece, and then the next piece I um, want to kind of carry on those decisions, but then add in some other element, whether that's like right now I'm kind of working between these really saturated palettes and these much more muted earth tone palettes,
Mm-hmm.
and seeing how they evolve. They're currently kind of evolving separately, but um, hopefully there will be this moment where they
They all
start to
kind
like sync up
of
together. So Yeah, that's a little bit of what's happening in the studio right now.
Yeah, that's interesting. And are you strictly oil paint? Do you play with other materials as well when it comes to your paintings?
I mean, the paintings have at times I'll do an acrylic stain on the
Hmm.
background. And I use a lot of oil pastels, and I use those to create the drawings in the
Cool.
painting, the
Yeah.
kind of preliminary sketch. And what I really like about those is you can draw and they have this really kind of, it's like a super crusty line. But then you can wipe it away with a little bit of solvent. And they create these really beautiful kind of glows. And
Cool.
if I decide I need to move something in the composition, I'll just grab a different color. So they almost become like little color coded drawings. And sometimes, like the painting I just finished, I had at least 3 or 4 different um, compositions drawn out on it before I decided, like, okay, no, this is go with this one,
Yeah.
just make it. So there, yeah, it's funny. It's like it helps me work through a lot of the initial trepidation of encountering a like purely flat, bright white
Yeah.
surface, right?
Yeah.
Is kind
Hmm.
of just like to muck it up a little bit.
Yeah. Hmm.
Um, and yeah, I mean, there is this way that my paintings are very, in a lot of ways, they're very orderly. Like I don't consider myself an expressive painter. But within each shape, that's where I allow the texture to really become maybe a little more expressive, or have
Yeah.
um actually have texture or like a varying surface. So there's that energy, but it's captured within a shape,
Yeah.
rather than just being all over the place.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think there definitely is expressive qualities in the work. Yeah, like what you're saying, through the way that you're building texture, but also I think just through like the surprising nature of your color palettes. I think that something about the way that you're using color is very surprising and intriguing, and like keeps me like on my toes, especially again looking at like a body of work. Like your the reworlding exhibition, was that
Mhm.
the one of your most recent ones, like looking at some of the again install shots of that? I mean, just the variance in the color palettes even in there are just really exciting and interesting. They kind of create this feeling of surprise in them,
Mhm.
which I always enjoy when I'm looking at paintings, like the unexpected, like balance, but that happens between colors that you don't normally see together. All of a sudden, they're like singing a note that you haven't heard before, and you're like, "Whoa, that's never like seen those together." It's really interesting, especially the earth tones in relation to the saturated. I think they work so well together, the balancing of
Mhm.
those qualities. Do you when you're working, like are you do you make paint, or do you just kind of work from the tubes of paint? Like do you mix your own pigments or do anything like that? Like do you have anything kind of special in terms of your painting process? Or
Working with metallics is something I've been doing increasingly more and more of,
cool.
and learning about and trying to use them as another form of light in the painting.
Mm,
But they're very temperamental because it's mica, and so once you mix mica with something that's not mica, it loses its properties, right?
yeah,
So it's like
yeah,
a real balancing act. But otherwise, I think I work in a way that's pretty traditional.
yeah.
If you were to see my palette before I started painting, of course, there's the phase like in the middle of it where it's a total mess. But I I do a lot of mixing,
Hmm.
because I'm very specific about the color,
Yeah,
as you can probably
definitely.
see
Oh
in the
yeah.
work. And I
Yeah.
do use a lot of gradients as well.
Yeah.
So I like to mix out like a few steps of those gradients. And I often work in complements or near complements,
Hmm.
so that I have those like that spectrum of chromatic gray in between.
Yeah. Hmm.
And that's how each color is seen more vividly again through
Yes.
that contrast, right?
Yes, definitely.
So I don't know if there's anything necessarily that special, but that shift for me is something I started only doing when I was, I think towards the end of graduate school.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I was reading, might have been an interview with like Dana Schutz, whose
Mm-hmm.
work, is nothing, it's such a world away, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think I could be wrong, but
Yeah.
I think she was saying or talking about how methodical she is about her palette. And it was just this like revelation for me where I was like, oh, right. That's what I learned to do when I was making paintings that were representational,
Mm-hmm.
and how much more bandwidth and intentionality I had with the paint when I sat down and took the time to meditate
Mm-hmm.
on creating these palettes.
Yeah.
I had, and I just went back to doing that, and that studio practice really transformed the work because it
Yeah.
it opened up this huge kind of world of possibilities.
Yeah.
So it's almost like it's really counterintuitive that sometimes through kind of preliminary work or through being a little bit meticulous at the beginning, that one would actually have more room to be creative. But
Mm-hmm.
I found that was really the case for me,
Yeah, I think that
rather
is the
than,
case
yeah.
in a lot of sense, like it's like if I think one of the biggest intimidating factors for people who don't have an art practice is like when they get in front of like a blank canvas, they're like, I don't even know where to begin, like
Mm-hmm.
having like no limitations sometimes can be so overwhelming. So just creating a few limitations of some kind or another,
Mm-hmm.
actually in like some kind of like odd way creates more possibility for creativity as
Right.
opposed to just being wide open and there's no boundaries anywhere. Like having a few boundaries, even if it's the boundary of the shape of the canvas or the
Mm-hmm.
boundary of the actual material choice or the boundary of a color palette or whatever, creates is this like kind of infinite possibility for iteration and creative potential
Mm-hmm.
in it. So I definitely think that there is something to that, to be able to have that. But like having that sort of like consciousness and sort of self-reflective quality toward your own practice is really important to be able to contemplate like, what am I actually doing? How am I
Mm-hmm.
actually approaching this? What if I changed this or that? How would that, sort of like snowball into a whole different sort of lexicon of things I could use as an artist in my painting. And
Mm-hmm.
so that is something I think that we should always be doing is kind of, you know, self-reflecting back on sort of the realities of our own process and painting practice from time to time, and to be critical and to be thoughtful about like why we make the choices that we make, even if
Mm-hmm.
sometimes we can't really know. But just having that sort of going through that exercise of asking those questions, I think are always, for me at least, have been so fruitful in creating insight. And I think not only like doing that as an artist, I find that like for me, like I'm really interested and deeply invested in meditative practice. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that and this and self-inquiry and like having a real sort of like dedication or discipline or devotion to really finding space and time to let go of the external sort of experience and really turn the light of consciousness inward on the inner landscape and
Mm-hmm.
have this sort of self-inquiry practice. Is that something that you do? Is that something that's been a part of your journey thus far, like in your life, is to have something separate from the art practice? Because I think that is a
Mm-hmm.
meditative practice for sure, but something a little more formal where you're actually on an individual level, like looking within yourself.
Yeah. Well, I think that question's interesting. It goes back to maybe even your first question about the like bodily aspect of the painting. So, I was a little late to painting in the grand scheme of things. I
Mm-hmm.
know so many artists that are like, oh yeah, I started painting when I was a kid and couldn't stop me. That wasn't really the case for me. So up until college, I was a dancer.
Oh, wow.
So I think, there's a lot there, right? With like the physicality, the bodily aspect, the movement, right? The
Hmm.
kind of the connections in the paintings, and um how they relate to like the body as it moves through space, and the
Yeah.
sense of time that's
Hmm.
kept, right?
Yeah.
In
Yes.
dance. So I did dance, and then I ended up going to school for painting. I had taken a class at this community college near me, um, in oil painting. And I had painted a little bit in high school with acrylic, but it didn't do too much for me. I was like, I like this, but I don't know. But then using oil, there was something about like the alchemical kind of qualities, like the oiliness, right? Like the
Hmm.
fleshiness of the
Hmm.
paint. A little bit of the danger too, I think I kind of liked. And then just the way, it remains open for so much longer.
Yeah.
So then I started painting, and I had a very long hiatus from dance or any kind of physical um, integration in the work. And only about a year and a half ago, I started getting really invested in a yoga practice. And
Awesome.
um, it was actually from injuring myself painting that
Really?
I
Oh, no.
that
Oh,
I like
man.
got into yoga, which is it's funny. But yeah, so I do have that practice currently, and of course there's meditation involved in within that. And yeah, I guess I have that practice that
Yeah. Yeah.
I do alongside of painting. And I don't think when I'm painting, I don't think it's similar to meditation at all.
Hmm. Yeah.
It is not that part of my mind that I'm
Yeah.
using. My mind's very active when I'm painting and
Yeah.
or drawing. And I actually like to like talk on the phone when I'm, like I like to, or like listen to podcasts, or
Yeah.
like constantly being interrupted by technology or cats or whatever it is. So it's funny, it's like very much not a meditative practice. And for me, that practice is separate from the studio practice.
Okay, cool.
Um, Even though it does look that way, I think, in the work. I often get questions like, oh, are these meditative? Are you meditating? And I'm like, well, no, not when I'm actually painting, but
Yeah.
I do that elsewhere.
Yeah.
So it's for me, it's a totally different energy.
Yeah.
um yeah.
Well, I think that's interesting. I mean, in terms of like your journey from a dancer and then going into painting, but then finding yoga,
Hmm.
and the way that you found it. I mean, that's such a powerful practice. It's definitely so I can relate to it because I've been practicing yoga for a long time, and it's transformed my mind and body in ways that I could have never been, I don't think, without that practice.
Hmm.
Because it brings you into a really like deep dramatic intimacy with your inner landscapes, right? Like back to
Hmm.
where we started this, like
Yeah.
it really brings you to the forefront of like the inner workings of your own mind and the attachments within your own sense of identity and your own sense of your roles in the world, right? And the things that you do. And it kind of like gives you a sort of a map of some kind to discover like what's beyond those things, like almost like you're like digging a well down to like the origins or the foundations of who it is that you are. And through that process you have to peel back all these layers of identity or attachment or things that have been kind of like given to you or things that you've inherited or things that you've adopted over the course of your lifetime. And it gives you like almost this portal down to the bottom so that you can, bring back up all
Hmm.
sorts of insights or energy or even images. I don't know. For me, like the more I go on that meditative journey, the more I dive deep into yoga practice, the more like I find that this imagery of what's happening within myself is manifesting through actual visual forms of in my mind, like call them visions, call them flashes of insight, call them hallucinations, or call them dream states or dreamlike states or whatever. But there is a way in which I find that my own body is communicating to me in a way that like is expressed through visual language. It's kind of hard to express or pinpoint, but I find that to be a fascinating component to these practices of self-inquiry, is that every now and then, even if it's like on a random, seemingly like, you know, 5-minute meditation, all of a sudden there's just this flash of something and you just, what the hell, where did that come from? What is that? And I find that to be like a source of like deep inspiration, but also like gives me something to like maintain my like humility and the fact that like this is so mysterious. Life is just unbelievably mysterious. And then it gives me kind of fodder for like art making, like something to chew on, something to think about, something that ultimately will be expressed in some way through making art. So even if like for you, like you're not actively engaging in a meditative experience or practice while you're painting, the fact that you're doing that kind of work for yourself outside of your studio practice is ultimately going to find its way into
Of
what you
course.
do, and I think that's such a beautiful thing because I find nothing but positivity that's come from it for me personally. So I think that's really awesome that you've kind of begun that journey. So I say just keep going with it,
Yeah. Yeah, we'll see where it leads, but I agree there is something that's really ineffable about that practice and how it changes the creative process.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is, again, it's like this embodied experience where you have the chance to listen to your physical self and your kind of intellectual overlording mind has to shut up a little bit,
I
right?
love that phrase, overlord.
That's how I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
about
Oh,
it
I get it.
sometimes.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
just like,
Definitely. Oh, yeah.
um
Our thoughts are
so
crazy sometimes. You're like, what
yeah,
the
why so many at one
Yeah.
time? um So yeah, I think that
Oh,
that's, I have yet to see how that's really worked its way into my practice. I think maybe it goes back to being a little bit more decisive about the paintings, and also having um even, I think in this last show I started doing it, and I'm doing it a little more, where I have larger areas of, say, like flat color or one consistent pigment, and allowing the properties of that color, of that pigment, of that specific texture um, to be showcased
yeah.
as is, right? And how that's almost this act of generosity with the paint and the materiality, right,
Yeah.
of what pigment is, to have it showcased in such a way, and to be able to look at that and reflect on all of that, all of those properties and that visual experience of just looking at, say, like a color, instead of feeling like I need to temper with something as
Yeah.
much. So I think that that is a way that it's slowly transforming my work. And yeah, it goes, I think a little bit back to thinking about like, well, what is paint
Yeah.
even, right? Like, and paint is this it is an alchemical process.
Yes.
It is about transformation. You're taking minerals from the earth, sometimes directly,
Yeah.
sometimes historically from animals or insects,
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes now through chemical processes of heating,
Yep.
drying, but you're taking these minerals, these pigments that are derived from the earth, and then the act of painting is you're transforming them. And sometimes I become interested in both that transformation and then also that material reality simultaneously, and how both things can be seen together in a painting.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's something for me why I think I love painting, is because of the reality of like where the minerals, where the pigments, like where, and the fact that like we've over long time have decided to like utilize them, harmonize with them, collaborate with the mineral world to be able to use them to make the marks that we make and to create the images that we make. There's this collaboration happening with the earth itself in a painting. And I think that is like such an important thing to remember when we look at paintings. And so I think that like taking that like awareness of the actual materiality, like the reality of what the material is we're using is so important. It's just up leveling our consciousness toward the act so that we can be even more fully present and, I guess, intimate with it. You know what I mean? Because we have a deeper understanding of what we're doing. And I think it's from that we can become vessels or tools for the universe to speak through us in some ways. This intelligence or this mysterious majesty that permeates reality can move through an individual and sort of influence their decision making on some level.
Well, so the show, the installation behind me, or the last show I did, I called Reworlding, but a lot of the inspiration or impetus behind the show was actually kind of thinking about ultramarine and the history of that color. So the work in the show used, various ultramarines, various pigments of ultramarine, of lapis. And ultramarine means like from beyond, the sea, but it also, in like a loose translation, right? But it also means like from another world, right? Like beyond the sea was another world, right? If you had never been there. So using that color really intentionally in the pieces to talk about, ideas of like reworlding, like reconstructing these natural inspired worlds compositionally, but then also how that is directly imbued in the history of this material itself. So sometimes the decisions in my work are they have that kind of maybe metaphor to something that would otherwise feel like just an intuitive decision. There's oftentimes like a little bit more of like a intentionality behind the pieces.
Well, it's such beautiful work, Theresa, and like I just feel wherever this is evolving toward, I just really love like your thought process and your approach to what you're doing. And I think that there's just infinite possibilities of how you can continue to push this language that you're developing. And for me, they're incredibly powerful. I can't wait for the day I can actually see one in person, because I'm only getting a very limited vantage point on them, seeing them through a screen. But like being an artist and seeing so much art in my life and making work, like I can make that translation a little easier than the average person because of the experiences I've had. So I can just tell the way that you're handling the material. And it's just wonderful. And so everybody out there that's listening, you have to check out Theresa's work. I'll have links to the show notes, to her Instagram, and any other links that you want me to add to the show notes later. Just let me know. We can talk about that. But this has been such an amazing conversation. I mean, we're a little over an hour right now. I feel like we could just keep going, but maybe for another time. But I think for now, I think it was just a really beautiful exchange. And I just want to thank you for taking the time to hang out with me on the podcast today.
No, thank you for inviting me on.
Yeah, it's so good. And we'll be in touch soon. Okay. So enjoy the rest of your day.
You too. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you all so much for tuning into this episode of Concerning the Spiritual and Art. If you like what we're doing here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you can stay in touch and in tune with all the amazing offerings that we're going to be bringing to this channel. Thanks again for all your support. Super grateful, and excited to bring more content your way. Peace, y'all.